Hello, I am Ed Runkle, pastor of Tapestry Church, and I hope you enjoy today's message. We welcome you. I'm so glad you're here. Welcome to Tapestry Church, everybody. I'm so glad you're here. I have a question for you this morning. Have you ever noticed sometimes when we greet each other, we'll ask, "How are you doing?" And occasionally someone will respond, "I'm doing okay under the circumstances." Have you ever heard that, or maybe you've even said that yourself? Well, this morning we're going to look at some scripture texts, mostly from the Old Testament Psalms, in which the psalmists say we don't live under the circumstances because our God is above the circumstances, so we can live above the circumstances. So I have a couple of texts for you. First, this series is called Promises, and I want to read the promise verses from Psalm 46, verse 1, where we're told that God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. And then from Psalm 91, I think I have verses 1 through 5 and then 9 through 14 for you. He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will abide in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say to the Lord, my refuge and my fortress, my God, in whom I trust. For he will deliver you from the snare of the fowler and from the deadly pestilence. He will cover you with his pinions, and under his wings you will find refuge. His faithfulness is a shield and a buckler. You will not fear the terror of the night, nor the arrow that flies by day. Because you have made the Lord your dwelling place, the Most High, who is my refuge, no evil shall be allowed to befall you, no plague come near your tent. For he will command his angels concerning you to guard you in all your ways. On their hands they will bear you up, lest you strike your foot against a stone. You will tread on the lion and the adder, the young lion and the serpent you will trample underfoot. Because he holds you fast to me in love, I will deliver him. I will protect him because he knows my name. Let me begin with this. Here's what these Psalms are not saying. They're not saying, if you had faith and you absolutely trusted God, if you really trusted God, no evil would befall you, nor affliction would come your way. And if they do, well, obviously, you don't trust God enough. And it's not like faith, any amount of faith can kind of block the darkness or the doubt that we experience in this world. I mean, when on the cross, Jesus didn't cry out, "Here I come." He said, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" I like how the psalmist puts it in Psalm 34 and verse 8, where he talks about God's refuge. He says, "Blessed is the one who takes refuge in him." And I think what I like most is what that doesn't say. It doesn't say, "Blessed in the one who fixes himself." It doesn't say, "Blessed is the one with a life so perfect that she doesn't need refuge." It says, "Blessed is the one who takes refuge in him." As in, guess what? You're going to need refuge. Life is going to have situations that require you to have to take refuge. The need for refuge isn't, because of some kind of personal failure. It's just reality in this broken world. But be blessed, for there is a place to go. I mean, that's what the idea of refuge is all about, right? It's a place to go that is safe. I mean, just think about it in terms of all the people who have in recent, months poured into, Turkey from Syria. They're looking for a refuge. They're looking for a safe haven from civil war in Syria, from the Islamic State, or think of our church. We call this particular space the sanctuary. In other words, it's intended to be a place of refuge, a safe place. So when somebody comes here for worship or for some other function, they may be not a part of our community. They might be a stranger. They might not be all that comfortable around church. But we want, when they come in here, we want them to feel safe, to feel embraced, to feel, that we are, these folks here are saved. I mean, these texts that we're looking at this morning, these Psalms are confessions of people who've been in the snare of the hunter, as they have put it, who've known the terror of night, have laid wasting from sickness, and not only survived, but survived with a new vision that enabled them to see that in the midst of the worst that life can dish out, they were safe in the arms of God. The psalmist in each case is not saying that bad things won't happen to us, but what they're saying is that bad things won't get to us. I mean, you see the difference there? They won't conquer us, bad things, because God is a mighty fortress. It's not like faith is some kind of magic wand, that just gets rid of everything that hurts us, but rather God is the shield that enables us to go out and face things that do in fact hurt us, but cannot defeat us. Honestly, I sometimes cringe when I hear some well-meaning soul, say to someone who's experienced a loss or is struggling with something, God has a plan. Maybe you've heard that or said something like that. I think we mean well when we speak that. We mean it as a source of encouragement and comfort. But sometimes I can imagine, someone hearing that and thinking, well, wonderful. It's like, I almost thought that maybe for just a moment there was a lapse in God's omnipotence. Of course He has everything under control. That's the problem. I'm hurting right now, and He's sitting on His hands. I don't like His plan right now. And reminding me that what's going on in my life was at the very least passively allowed by the cosmic micromanager, that doesn't cheer me up. I appreciate you trying. I can feel your good intentions. It's just that what you're saying is kind of having the opposite effect. One of the unique things about God is that God is sovereign and that He has a plan. And even more, He displays His glory by helping rather than demanding help. And when we ask Him for help, we know that He will give it for His name's sake. That is, not because we deserve it, but because His helping highlights His riches. God exalts His grace and power by giving help rather than by demanding it. He designs the Christian life in such a way that we get the joy as He gets the glory. But here's the mistake that we are inclined to make when we attempt to make sense out of things in our lives. At least I'm inclined to make this mistake. I imagine that the help God gives, I imagine that looking like an increased capacity, to accomplish what I want to accomplish, or the capacity to escape, these challenges that have come up along the way. But the help that God supplies, on the other hand, often isn't this increased capacity to accomplish what we'd like to accomplish or to escape it, but the increased capacity to endure, that which we would rather escape. Let me try to connect some dots for you here. Some of you may remember that at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, He was led into the wilderness where He was tempted by Satan. Remember how in one of the temptations, Satan took Him to the city of Jerusalem, to the top of the temple, and encouraged Him to throw Himself down. You can find this in the New Testament gospel writer Matthew in chapter 4. I don't know if you recognize the fact that Satan quotes Scripture when he encourages Jesus to throw Himself down. And this text that he quotes is the one I read earlier from Psalm 91. For He will command His angels concerning you. On their hands they will bear you up, lest you strike your foot against the stone. In other words, Satan was encouraging Jesus to take advantage of God's unconditional, unqualified promise of protection, but Jesus refused that kind of interpretation. And see, what happens is when our conceptions or ideas of God's promise of protection and His, idea of what that promise means collide, we kind of grow frustrated with God. We lose heart because we ask for help, and what we receive, it seems, sometimes is less helpful. In fact, things may get worse, and our weaknesses are heightened and not diminished. But what's really happening is that it's not God's negligence or indifference to our prayers, but mostly a conflict between our expectations and God's intentions. The biblical pattern of God helping and strengthening His people, God chooses a sinful, weak person to be His redeemed saint. God then further weakens this person through circumstantial or physical adversity. That person is then forced to trust God's promises. God then proves Himself faithful to those promises, and that person's faith thereby is strengthened, and hope begins to build up in this person. And his or her faith doesn't rest in the wisdom of the world then, but in the power of God. And so when we're in financial trouble, we take refuge in God, a God who knows what we need, and a God who can grant us contentment and peace, whether we have much or little. Or when we're in relational trouble, when our heart is breaking, when people we love have hurt us or disappointed us because of the brokenness of this world, God doesn't always spare us the pain of that, but will protect us from the bitterness and vengeance and anger and isolation that could grow out of that kind of situation. In other words, we know that God won't always stop stinky stuff from happening to us, but when we choose to dwell in Him, we gain a kind of buffering wall that helps us to cope with all the stinkiness, all the assaults and onslaughts that life might send our way. Dwelling in God is like finding a safe haven or sanctuary from those people and things which would pursue and harm us. And it makes sense then that Christians have been the primary creators and supporters of places of refuge, like battered women's shelters or homeless shelters or orphanages and hospitals and even sanctuary programs for illegal immigrants, because we believe that God is in the business of providing refuge and protection for the vulnerable and the weak. So to claim this promise of refuge, of protection, it's to realize that while bad things may happen to us, they won't get to us. Let me ask you, when you find yourself troubled or weary or disappointed, where do you go? What do you do with that? Where does your soul find rest? Because it will, seek rest somewhere. I saw an interesting story recently where a study shows that usually we don't respond when a fire alarm rings. Instead of leaving the building immediately, we kind of stand around and wait for more clues. But even with more information, we still don't make a move. And sometimes that proves deadly. For instance, back in 1985, 56 people were killed when a fire broke out in the stands of a soccer match in England. And close examination of the television footage showed that fans didn't react immediately, but continued to watch both the fire and the game and failed to move toward the exits. Research has also shown that when we do move, we tend to follow old habits. We don't trust emergency exits. We almost always try to exit the room through the same door that we entered. And so after a fire at a club in Kentucky left 177 people dead, forensic experts confirmed that many of the victims sought to pay before leaving. And so they actually died while waiting in line. The study concluded that we don't want an exit if we don't know exactly where it's going to take us, or even, and especially so in an emergency. We want to know what new story we're stepping into before we exit the old one. And I wonder if something similar doesn't go on with us when it comes to seeking refuge in God. We're not sure what we're stepping into, so while we claim that God is our refuge and strength, we actually follow, sort of the old-fashioned way. We seek refuge in money in the bank, or a healthy report from the doctor, or the powerful people who are on our side. We don't seek refuge in God alone. And our relative, kind of prayerlessness is an expression of our kind of limited confidence in God's ability to provide. So we run for refuge to the creation rather than the Creator. And when we do, we never really find the solace we're seeking. We may successfully numb or distract ourselves for a while, but our hearts aren't strengthened or encouraged. And you see this sometimes when a person's world is crumbling around her and she, throws herself maybe even into something at church, one activity after another, or one meeting after another, because rather than confront the pain, the person kind of wants to run from it. In that case, the church is not a refuge, but more like a form of escape or self-medication, or a job. When things aren't going well at home, maybe not getting respect, or people don't listen to you at home. The best and easiest way to forget about that reality is to forge a new one at the office, where maybe you are valued by your colleagues, and you are listened to, and feel that people value you. It's an escape. Or people look around and find their lives slipping away, and realize they spent decades doing the same thing, and have nothing for it. And it's easy to try to escape the current reality and fantasy. And there's all kinds of pornography and online dating and so on that serves that need. I mean, in times of trouble, in the out of my control circumstances, on the crooked, dark, winding paths, in the I don't get this days, you and I will run to something or someone for refuge and for strength and encouragement. And the question is, to whom or what will we run? Because that relationship that we've invested so much time in is not our refuge and strength, and that job or that house is not going to be an ever-present help in time of trouble. It's not the economy that gives us our strength. It's not the age, appearance, condition, health of our bodies which provides help. And see, these replacement refuges of people and things, they can't relieve, only distract us from our burdens. And what happens is then we return to them repeatedly, and instead of ending up strengthened and encouraged, we end up addicted or indebted or whatever. I mean, what I'm trying to get at is that when you're weak and weary and discouraged, do you run to the one refuge who can deliver? Do you even, recognize your need for refuge? I suppose, that's a step that needs to happen. To, access God's refuge is to own and admit the fact that something or someone is chasing you and it's wearing you out. And unless you find a city of refuge, a hiding place, wings to crawl under, you're going to be in trouble. Sometimes it seems we don't view our problems as worthy of refuge or as worthy of God's attention. You know what I mean? Maybe you've thought this, or maybe you've said this, something to the effect, the stuff I go through is petty in comparison to this. Whether it comes from witnessing a horrible tragedy on the news or walking with a friend who's going through something unimaginable. I mean, probably you, as I, will sigh in the heaviness of all that and think something along the lines that, man, what I'm going through is nothing like that. And I suppose that while processing tragedy in that way isn't exactly wrong, there's no, God uses external tragedies to kind of give us inner perspective. But pain is pain. And I have a hard time believing God ever intended us, for us to go so far as to let others' pain shame us into believing that ours is petty or unworthy of God's attention. Doesn't matter what form trouble takes or how it's delivered or how long it stays, God alone is our accessible, protected place of refuge and retreat. In fact, when God is our refuge and retreat, strength, we, not only find relief, we can find joy. The psalmist in Psalm 63 says, "For you've been my help, and in the shadow of your wings I will sing for joy." It's not just a matter of when we run to God for refuge, of hiding and cowering and holding our breath until the danger passes. We sing for joy because we're so secure. God isn't just an escape from the stress of the world, but a way that, a source of power to move forward with confidence and hope. I think of Paul, and he writes from a Philippian church in Roman, to the Philippian church from a Roman prison. This great question he asks. He's dealing with all this stuff, and he goes, "But what does it matter? I have all these problems, but what does it matter?" And in Greek, it's actually much punchier. It's just two words, two little words, tiskar. So what? Big deal. Who cares? That's a great, question for you to take into this coming week. Anytime something goes wrong, and things will go wrong as you go through this week, ask the question, so what? God is my strength and my refuge. Paul goes on to say, I eagerly hope that I will in no way be ashamed, but will have sufficient courage, so that now, as always, Christ will be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death. For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. What are you going to do with a guy like that? How are you going to stop a guy like that? What prison can hold a guy like that? When God is our refuge and strength, what more do we need? There's another verse in Psalm 46, which our memory verse was verse 1. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. But later in that same psalm, there's this great verse in verse 10, "Be still and know that I am God." So often we fight for control. We try to manipulate things. And in that, God is not served, and we only get ourselves all worked up. And, I don't know, maybe some of you have seen this. It was in the news not too long ago that an Air Force airman was re-enlisting, and he kind of crossed out the "So help me God" part of the paperwork in that. And the Air Force at first wouldn't let him re-enlist, but then there were going to be lawsuits. And so the Air Force changed its policy, making that part of the swearing in optional. And my initial reaction was, there's one more thing that kind of puts God and faith to the margins of society. I was kind of worked up. Then I thought about it. Does it make sense to require a person to swear in the name of a deity he or she doesn't believe in? And, doesn't requiring a religious oath for military service kind of constitute a religious test for public office, which the Constitution doesn't allow? And more to the point, at a time when religious liberty of Christians is threatened, more and more, shouldn't Christians support the religious liberty of everyone, including atheists? Or as the psalmist put it, shouldn't we just be still and cut it out and acknowledge that God is the one in charge, to, let God be God? One writer in his book, Spiritual Depression, Its Causes and Cures, talks about that most of our unhappiness in life is due to the fact that we're listening to ourselves rather than talking to ourselves. He writes, in effect, that instead of listening to all those thoughts that kind of, tear us up and keep us stuck in our problems, we need to talk to ourselves, reminding ourselves who God is and what God is and what God has done and what God has pledged Himself to do. And that's what these writers of the Psalms that we've been looking at this morning are doing. They're kind of talking to themselves about God and how they've known Him to be their refuge, their help in trouble. And we get to overhear them. You know, it's a matter of letting God be God. And when we do that, we find that He is our refuge and our strength, our fortress. We can abandon ourselves to His sovereignty and know that regardless of the script we think we'd like to write for our lives, we can trust that He will handle things perfectly for our sake and for His glory. We hope you enjoyed today's message. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we welcome you to join us at Tapestry Church. We meet on Sundays at 10:30 a.m. at 22 Crady Avenue in Millersville, Pennsylvania. Thank you.